R.F. Kuang's 2022 novel Babel is a dark academia fantasy in which magic is a result of translation. As such, many conversations in the book explore the act of translating across languages and time. Some characters' perspectives are presented in an optimistic light, such as, "This is just what translation is, I think. That's all speaking is, listening to the other and trying to see past your own biases to glimpse what they're trying to say, showing yourself to the world and hoping someone else understands." Other perspectives are more cautious, even skeptical. Translation means doing violence upon the original, means warping and distorting it for foreign, unintended eyes. So then, where does that leave us? How can we conclude except by acknowledging that an act of translation is then necessarily always an act of betrayal? This book filled my soul when it was released, largely because it was right around that time that I was starting to feel at least somewhat comfortable working with Latin texts sometimes. Though it didn't take much to find a line that gutted what shred of confidence remained in my tattered ego. But to find characters exploring the same questions that were swirling in my mind was exhilarating. At the time, I was very much on team translate everything ancient. I loved what I was learning about antiquity, and it was knowledge I wanted to make as accessible as possible to as many people as possible. And yet I'd heard so many people insist that you must read X or Y text in the original language, that the English just isn't good enough. I was, and in many ways still am, skeptical of this claim. Just how much could possibly be hidden in the original language that can't be communicated? If not in translation, at least in footnotes. Sure, maybe some beauty or elegance could be lost along the way, but the ideas, the real meat of the communication, surely that could be carried across the literal meaning of translate, time, language, culture, and whatever other barriers might persist. But is this, as the professor in Babel puts it, a betrayal against the original? If every act of translation is an act of violence, leaving shreds strewn in the wake of the journey to rip the original idea from its time and place and bring it to a new world and foreign minds, is it even possible to bring antiquity to a modern audience? Or is it less a matter of time and money and more a matter of pragmatics, that these ancient ideas are inevitably at their core stuck in their time, transfixed in place, and the only way to understand them is to put in the grueling labor to bring yourself back and immerse yourself in the strange land that is the past, to understand the ideas the way their original audience would have understood them. It was Juno, the Roman equivalent of the Greek goddess Hera, the feisty, fiery wife of Jupiter/Zeus, who helped me glimpse the complexity that is translating an ancient text. It was her role in the epic poem The Aeneid, which so enthralled me that I knew I wanted to dive deeper into this ancient world. In this journal entry of my own academic journey, I want to document two lines in particular which set the events of the Aeneid in motion. I'll touch on a few other lines as well, but it's lines 50 and 90 of book 1 that were the ones that helped me really get a taste of the power in ancient poetry and the complexity of translating it. So let's taste test Virgil by looking at his portrayal of Juno. Publius Vergilius Maro, known to us as the poet Virgil, is one of the most celebrated poets of all time, the king of Latin poetry. For 10 years, from the age of 42 until his death a decade later, he worked on the Aeneid. The poem was to be an epic, detailing the flight of the mythological founder of Rome, Aeneas, from Troy and his settling in Italy. Simultaneously, the poem was supposed to act as a kind of propaganda for Virgil's patron, Caesar Augustus, and the extent to which Virgil complied with this could be a whole series of videos in of itself. Suffice it to say that some portions of the Aeneid do seem to foreshadow future events and prophesy of Augustus, such as the shield of Aeneas depicting Caesar's victory against Mark Antony and Cleopatra in Actium just 2 years before Virgil began working on the poem. But one can also find numerous lines that seem to subtly subvert the regime, and several other lines were clearly left unfinished. Incredible as the poem is, what we have is just the world's best first draft, one Virgil supposedly wished to be burned upon his death, but Augustus, apparently satisfied with what had been shared with him thus far, ordered it be published anyway, even in its unfinished state. The Aeneid is divided into 12 books. The first 6 seem to parallel Homer's Odyssey, and the second 6 parallel Homer's Iliad, the Greek epic poems composed roughly 7 centuries before Virgil's life. In the first half, the Roman poet Virgil has his hero Aeneas escape Troy and one-up his Greek opponent Odysseus in many regards. Whereas Odysseus sacrificed 6 men to the beast Scylla in order to avoid the whirlpool Charybdis, Aeneas and his crew successfully sail through the whirlpool without losing a man. When they behold the bloodied Cyclops on Aetna, they wisely keep their distance and escape safely, no shouted insults that brought harm to Odysseus's crew. In the last 6 books of the Aeneid, Aeneas settles in Italy and is driven to war, though instead of the Iliad's Mycenaean king Agamemnon fighting Troy's Priam over Helen, it's Aeneas fighting Turnus over the Latium princess Lavinia. Now you might be asking, what does this have to do with Juno? Fortunately for you, that is exactly what I was about to explain. Juno is to Aeneas as Poseidon is to Odysseus. She is the god whose wrath Aeneas has engendered. Just as in the Iliad and Odyssey, so much of human strife here is chalked up to the wrath of gods. It all begins when Eris, being the chaotic Greek goddess of strife that she is, brought a golden apple to a wedding feast to which she was not even invited. The apple was to be given to the fairest goddess, and Eris had the Trojan prince Paris, son of Priam, decide whether to give the apple to Hera, her Roman equivalent being Juno, Aphrodite, or Venus, or Athena, that is, Minerva. Paris chose Aphrodite, who gave him Helen as a prize, and thus the Trojan War began. Menelaus wanted his wife Helen back, and the gods warred alongside the humans, Aphrodite on Team Troy, Hera on Team Greece. So, Hera/Juno is already set up not to like the Trojans, and in this case her anger is fixed on the fleeing Trojan, only briefly mentioned in the Iliad, Aeneas. Now add to all of this the insult that Zeus had had some extramarital affairs with Aeneas's ancestors, and that Aeneas's descendants would go on to destroy Juno's favorite city, Carthage, and you've got Aeneas stuck between mortals who would infuriate the goddess. Juno thus takes it on herself to ensure Aeneas never makes it to Italy. Now, at this point you might be thinking of Juno as a villain, and she is portrayed that way, and it would be easy for us to consider a shallow villain. She wanted to be seen as the most beautiful among mortals, she's lashing out at mortals for wrongs done to her by her philandering husband, and she's positioned as the antagonist against the hero Aeneas, whom we're all rooting for. But as I worked through the first lines of the Aeneid, I kept finding myself surprised by Juno. She comes off to me as an empathetic character, one who has been wronged and is tortured by humiliation, fear, and anger that refuses to relent. Look at some of these lines, not the 2 that I want to focus on, but ones I'll roughly translate to give you an idea of what's going on in Juno's mind right now. Starting in line 23, Virgil writes, "Fearing this referring to Rome overthrowing Carthage at some future point, and mindful of the past war, which she foremost had led at Troy for her beloved Argives, that is, the Greeks, for the cruel agonies, these causes of her fury, had not yet fallen from her soul, burning with these things, she kept off far from Latium the Trojans, buffeted all over the seas, remnants of the wrath of cruel Achilles of the Greeks." So what we're being given here is a goddess who's afraid. The first line starts off with an allusion to the future, followed immediately by a war of the past. And note the chiasmus, this ABBA structure, a poetic figure that is more available in an inflected language like Latin, which uses the endings of words to show their position in the sentence. In English, word order determines the subjects, objects, which adjectives go with which nouns, and so on. So we have to say, in this order, Juno is mindful of the past war. We are quite restricted when it comes to flexibility. If I were to swap the subject and the direct object, saying the past war is mindful of Juno, that changes the role that these words play in the sentence. If I wanted for some reason a sentence that started with a direct object, we might have to sound like Yoda and uncomfortably conclude with a preposition, or else we would sound overly formal. The past war Juno is mindful of, or of the past war war, Juno is mindful. Yeah, English is not the most flexible language. It isn't that sentence order doesn't matter in Latin, it does. It just doesn't necessarily show the words' roles in the thought. Rather, it sort of paints a little picture for the audience, revealing the priorities of the writer. The daughter of Saturn, Juno, is literally surrounded here by war. She is mindful, so mindful of the war that if she looks forward or backward, she still sees Troy. Can a goddess get PTSD? That's kind of what it sounds like is happening here. The next lines would corroborate such an idea. The pain, the agony described as siwi, cruel, related to the English word savage, churns her rage and doesn't seem to relent. She is later described as burning with or from these things, and it is this perpetual cocktail of rage and fear and fire that compels her to stave off the fleeing Trojans, knowing where they will later bring the havoc of Troy. But it's a hopeless endeavor, one she acknowledges the fates themselves must oppose. In line 37, she even refers to herself as me victam, I defeated, the perfect passive participle victam, having been conquered, used in apposition to the personal pronoun me, a way of saying X is equal to Y. She's not just saying that she's been beaten, she is saying that she is defeat. Loss and I are one thing. It is this mindset that, to me, culminates in line 50, the first of the two lines that fully won me over. Here's my rough translation. The goddess, pondering such things in her heart, into the country of clouds, a place teeming with the furious southern winds, into Aeolia she came. And this first line, Talia flamato secum dea corde volutans, I love it, and I hate my translation of it, and I want to explain why. First, let's focus on that first line, going word by word. Talia is a neuter accusative plural, translating to such. Such what? Well, it's neuter and it's plural. Things, then. Such things, such matters, the matters that we've been discussing up to this point. Her rage, her fear, her ambitions, her defeat. And that its accusative tells us that it will be the direct object of the sentence. Flamato, you can probably tell. Inflamed, kindled, something set on fire, burning, blazing. We've got plenty of poetic translation options to work with. Pick your own. It's an adjective, so we'll look for what it's tied to. Secum means with her, the se connected to the next word, dea, the goddess. So the goddess with herself, and these are nominatives, so they will be the subject of the sentence. But this phrasing, the goddess with her, or with herself, it makes for a bit of an odd literal translation. How much can we play with this before we start to abandon, or to use Babel's term, betray the original sense? Like, would it be okay for me to say that the goddess is alone with herself? Is she by herself? If we wanted to get poetic and embellish the idea, we could say the isolated goddess, the lonely goddess, or am I starting to stray too far from the literal translation, the goddess with herself? Next, we've got corde, heart. The E ending indicating that this word is ablative. We often translate the ablative case in English with some preposition, by, with, or from, the most common. But here you have a construction awkwardly called the ablative of place where. Yes, that's its real name. Gotta love construction names. So the heart is the place where something is happening. And we have an adjective that matches in case, number, and gender, flamato. So it's not just a heart, but a burning or blazing heart. The last word is volutans, the ns ending indicating it's a present active participle, one of many things that in English is represented with an ing ending. It comes from the verb volutare, meaning to roll or to revolve, but many verbs in Latin have both a physical and a mental sense. What would be the mental version of rolling something around, letting it turn or churn in your mind? Perhaps ponder, to turn something over in one's mind. I've even seen the word wallow used as a translation, which would feel appropriate given what we've seen of Juno, though it doesn't really convey that rotational sense that I really like here, the cyclical thoughts that she seems to be trapped in, her own mental Charybdis. So the literal word-by-word translation is such things burning with her, the goddess, in her heart, turning. hence my rearranged translation. The goddess, pondering such things in her burning heart. We have the literal translation set up, but that's not all we're working with if we really want to carry across the meanings embedded in this line. Remember, this is poetry. Virgil is using here what's called dactylic hexameter. The term hexameter tells us we're looking for 6 metrical feet, which are primarily comprised of dactyls, that is, one stressed syllable, or in Latin, a long vowel, followed by 2 unstressed syllables, or 2 short vowels. So if I said, this is dactylic hexameter, I've given you dactyls that form 3 metric feet. Now, poetic conventions also allow for a spondaic substitution for a dactyl. A spondy has 2 stressed syllables, or 2 long vowels. If you asked me for an example and I said, no way, each word with equal emphasis, I've accidentally given you an example of a spondy. In dactylic hexameter, each line of poetry should end with a dactyl in the penultimate foot and then a spondy in the ultimate foot. And that's why we see corde volutans. Here's line 50 with the long vowels capitalized. Note the presence of both dactyls and spondies. Talia flammato se cum dea corde volutans. Now, how would we preserve this poetic sense while translating the line into English? We could do a direct translation of each word, but we would obviously have to rearrange the word order so it makes sense in English, and this is what I did earlier, but Virgil is writing in poetry. Do we then look at our list of word options for each individual Latin word and pick ones that would convert to the correct sequence of stressed and unstressed syllables? Should our translation be in dactylic hexameter? And let's just say we have permission to ignore what in the Latin is a dactyl or a spondy for the sake of simplicity. In that case, I could take my literal translation and turn it into something with dactyls. For example, Juno alone with her thoughts sat there thinking, her heart set aflame. And now I've got 2 lingering short syllables I can use to, say, introduce the next line. I guess that works, but it feels a little clunky and casual, and I'm adding a bit to the translation, this idea of alone and sat there. I don't like the sound of it, but it fills the dactyl well enough. The Oxford World's Classics translation accomplishes this more elegantly with an extra little treat I'll bring up later. You'll hear some spondies as I read it. Inwardly spinning such thoughts, heart blazing with anger, the goddess. Robert Fagel's translation keeps the hexameter, but it plays a bit more with spondies. Not every line works out to 6 feet, and he only gives this portion a half line, pulling in part of a previous section. His line reads, ravished to the skies, her fury inflamed by all this. So we've got some nice little dactyls there. That's cool. But if I'd shown these lines to you, would you have noticed the meter? It feels not poetic, but to us, conversational. We don't recognize dactyls and spondies as rhythmic, but it definitely had a noticeable feel to ancient audiences, such that playwrights would fall into dactylic hexameter at times to give their lines a more epic flavor. Kind of like how we might, say, employ Shakespearean language to make something feel formal or old. In that case, should we create a translation that isn't dactylic hexameter, but something that feels to us modern audiences as poetic? Common meter is the term used to describe one of the most pervasive practices in modern poetry and music. It uses iambs, an unstressed followed by a stressed syllable, as opposed to dactyls or spondies, and it usually alternates between tetrameter in one line and trimeter in a second line, which works real nicely if you're aiming for that 4/4 timing so common in modern musical convention. We could use the lyrics to Amazing Grace as an example. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound. So you had 4 iambs right there, and then it sets up for 3 iambs in the second line, that saved a wretch like me, and then we would pause for a blank 4th iamb that gives us that 4/4 timing consistency, setting up for a repeated meter in the 3rd and 4th lines. I once was lost, but now am found, was blind, but now I see. You heard the meter clearly in that, right? Could we put this line into common meter? Say, the goddess pondered in her heart the burning, turning torments. Kind of like that little alliteration at the end and a bit of a rhyme. The rhyme is interesting. Rhyming might help it feel more poetic to us, but in antiquity, rhyming was seen as bad poetry, something to be mocked rather than emulated. So do we add in a little extra rhyming to clearly communicate to the audience the poetic vibe of the original? Or do we resist the temptation, stick to meter, and then risk the audience not even noticing the meter and missing that what they're reading or listening to is a poem? Put another way, do we bring the ancient text out of its time and accommodate it for modern tastes to give today's audiences a sense of the original? Or do we rip modern audiences from our time to give them a sense of what something was in antiquity? Agonizing over all this, one can hardly blame J.W. McHale for not even trying. He condenses the line into a short clause in prose. Fired with this also. That's it. That's all he does with line 50. A small throwaway line probably to most people, but I love it. McHale defends his total abandonment of a poetic translation in the preface of his work. He writes, "There is something grotesque in the idea of a prose translation of a poet, though the practice has become so common that it has ceased to provoke a smile or demand an apology. The attempt to copy the one material in the other must always count on failure to convey its poetic quality." Ooh, must always count on failure. That's spicy. And this is so with Virgil more, perhaps, than any other poet. Such a translation can only have the value of a copy of some great painting executed in mosaic. Don't think that you really need to bash mosaic there, but I get what you're saying. The frustration and this lament at the end. I can't help, though, that we could do better than a pixelated image of an ancient tapestry to modify his metaphor. Where I really get hung up isn't even in the meter, but the deeper poetic elements. Let's go back to the Latin. Each line of poetry has what's called a caesura, a cut or divide with a bunch of rules about where it can or cannot fall that I do not want to go into right now. But in short, you're most likely to find the caesura after the first long syllable of the third metrical foot. So a line of dactylic hexameter might look something like this. The effect of this cut in the line is a pause in its reading, one which, like pauses in modern speech, can have interesting oratorical effects. If we go back to the Oxford World's Classics translation I read earlier, we can see that they cleverly use spondies both at the end, where we would expect to find a spondee in dactylic hexameter, but also in the middle, a brilliant, subtle way of marking the caesura while emulating the dactylic hexameter. That's that treat I mentioned earlier was hidden in their translation. You are very welcome, hope you liked it. Now, most often the caesura simply separates two ideas. We can get a really nice, clear example of this from the very first lines of the Aeneid. "Of arms and the man I sing, who first from the shores of Troy." You heard that caesura in the middle, and it effectively divides the poet from the subject of the poem, from I, the singer, to the man, the subject, Aeneas, who is fleeing Troy. So what does the caesura do to line 50? Placed right here in the expected location, it complicates a literal translation, with the word rearrangement and adding in commas so it makes sense when read aloud for a modern audience. We have introduced our own caesuras, you could say, our own breaks. But do you notice what the caesura was doing to the original Latin line? Look at which word matches with which. What is the goddess pondering? Talia, such things. We've already noted that the adjective flammato goes with heart, and in the middle we have the goddess with herself. The caesura highlights another chiasmus, an extended one, ABC, CBA, turning this small line into a really cool word picture. We've been describing a goddess who is obsessing, who is engulfed, surrounded by intrusive thoughts. And what do we see in this line? The goddess beside herself, literally surrounded, her burning heart encapsulating her, and such things as the horrific past and daunting future swirling, turning around her. This is what I love so much about this line. It shows what it is describing. A goddess whose whole world are these anxieties that have her surrounded, and suddenly her vanity doesn't seem vain to me. Let's go back to the first insult, the one that started the whole Trojan War, that golden apple to be delivered to the fairest of the gods, the most beautiful, and Juno wasn't chosen. And then here we see the scorned goddess with herself. With herself. What could that mean? Could it be what we have explored? She's alone? Sure, maybe. But I can't help but envision here Juno in a position that the praised Aphrodite or the much sought after prize Helen were often portrayed. as seated before a mirror. A vanity, it is interestingly called. Maybe Juno is with herself in the sense that she is staring at her reflection in a mirror. The woman's beauty has been called into question, and in this poem she asks who after the war could possibly sacrifice to her now. She sees herself and sees one who is defeated, devalued. Is this vanity or is it insecurity? When she sees herself, she sees defeat. And when she sees Aeneas, she sees the product of the women who won her husband's eye over and over and over again. And surrounding the woman who now stares at her reflection is a heart aflame and a frame of intricate, woven, curled and curling anxieties, a tempest of doubts and fears and yes, fury. But can we blame her? And how would we translate this added dimension, especially within the confines of any poetic meter? We really can't. There's also another element to the chiasmus that just doesn't translate, but that adds more depth to poetry. This sequence, ABBA, can also communicate order, correctness, stability. This is the way things are. Another phrase that I'm sure joins the swirls in the storm of Juno's thoughts. Zeus's eyes wander, Aphrodite is more beautiful, the villainous Aeneas is escaping, the beautiful Carthage in the Romans' crosshairs, and the fates themselves oppose you. This is the way things are. So what do you do when you're imprisoned? What can a goddess do when the system as it exists incarcerates her? When Joan of Arc was reproached for her attempted escape from prison, she replied that it is lawful for all prisoners to attempt an escape. It is the prerogative of those in chains to try to break free from them. What does Juno do in this world of screwed up but stable order? She screws the order. Let there be chaos. We see this response narratively and poetically when Juno goes to Aeolus. The bitter goddess strides up to the wind god where struggling gales and howling hurricanes beat against their bonds, screaming for freedom, all enchained by the Lord of the Winds himself. Scepter of power in his hand, Aeolus sits on the throne atop this roaring mountain, keeping the tempests in their caves as Juno approaches and makes her queenly demand. This Trojan, Aeneas, and his crew cannot be allowed to escape to Italy. She orders Aeolus to unleash the winds and let them ravage the sailors until the Trojans are all swallowed by the sea. The descriptions of the wind god's mountain and his unleashing of the storms are gorgeous, but again, one line stands out to me above the others. Line 90. Intonvere poli et crebris mica dignibus aeter. The skies thunder and the air flashes with frequent fires. And again, my translation feels inadequate to communicate what's really happening here. Intonvere is a shortened version of the third person plural intonverunt, a convenient tactic when you're bound by meter, communicating the sense that the skies, poli, are roaring or thundering, one of many cacophonous words used in this section. But this is where we get the caesura, a break separating this thunderous sky from the beautiful second half of the line. The subject here is aether, ether, the air or the heavens above, and they micat, flash, tremble, quiver, like the heavens are about to be ripped apart. And what's doing the tearing? Fires which are crebris, frequent, crowded, something that can convey a sense of a packed throng, but also something constant and repeated. You could think of it as incessant flashing of lightning, as well as these incarcerated winds, all breaking free and gushing out of the mountain together. And did you notice the order of the terminology? A, B, A, B. A sort of spiritual opposite to the chiasmus called synthesis. This is where things are mixed up, a poetic figure that can communicate chaos, the breaking of order, like a storm mixing in the skies or a goddess defying fate. What blows my mind is that these two lines, lines 50 and 90 in the first book of the poem, show how poetry can complement the narrative. The chiasmus highlights the state of things at the beginning. Juno is defeated, the hated Trojan Aeneas is escaping. So what does the villain of the story do about it? She refuses to accept things the way they are. She sticks her middle finger to the world, the gods, and the fates themselves. She refuses to be defeated. As the chiasmus marks the orderly state of affairs at the beginning, the synthesis announces Juno's determination to do something about it all, to embrace chaos. And as the orderly sequence of the chiasmus parallels the entrapped goddess, the mixed-word order of synthesis parallels the goddess shaking off her shackles. This kind of poetic strategy, by the way, is pervasive throughout the poem. I happened to jump back into the Aeneid class while writing this, and the students there were a couple hundred lines into book 2, where Priam is about to fall to Pyrrhus, the son of Achilles. Retroactive spoiler warning, I guess. Right away, we spot another use of chiasmus and synthesis that amplify the narrative. Screaming chaos reigns in the heart of the palace. The hollow hallways howl with the keening of women's laments and the rhythmic beating of breasts. Vast sound drums glistening stars in its uproar. Another job well done from the Oxford World's Classics translation. I was as close to giddy as I get when we translated these lines together. Line 487 starts with miscatur. The miserable tumult is, quote, mixed, and appropriately, what follows immediately after is a mixing of word order, your chaotic synthesis. Kaiwai ides, the hollow hallways, and plangoribus femines, with women's laments. But right after they ululant, howl, a nice onomatopoeia there, you are almost lifted cinematically from the earth, where women howl and chaos reigns, to the golden stars, where in the heavens things are still in order, the fates very much in control. And here we have chiasmus, poetically adding to the contrast between heaven and earth. The clamor may strike the golden stars, but the gods remain unmoved. How do you translate this? To stick to the exact wording alone is to capture only a portion of what's being communicated. This poetic dimension is such a substantial element of the text, and it inevitably gets missed in translation. The basic sense is, sure, easy to retain. This is a story about a man, chaos fills the halls, Juno commands Iolaus to unleash the winds, but the artistry that makes the poem so powerful does not carry across time or language boundaries. To give someone a line-by-line translation is like serving them meat with no seasoning, no flavor, boxed and delivered cold, far removed from when and where and how it was meant to be served. And then we are shocked when someone takes a taste test and is underwhelmed. So, what do we do about this? I guess first acknowledge the problem. The world of ancient poetry is larger than what can be captured in a line. We can add footnotes, though with how much Virgil packed into his poetry, every line could get pages and pages of analysis. My Aeneid class's first lecture was on the very first line, a whole lecture. We spent more than an hour on it. I can make this video trying to communicate the depth, and we could study the language and culture and read the analyses by people who have made it their life to understand and communicate the past to the present, but in the end, all we get is a glimpse limited by the time that we have, the temporal distance that separates our culture from theirs, and the cacophonous war of things worth studying echoing through the caves of Aeolia. Life only gives us enough time to taste a small sample of the grand buffet that's before us. So this was my attempt at giving you a spoonful of Virgil. I've added some salt, your dactylic hexameter, a dash of pepper, your chiasmus and synthesis, but there's a spice rack full of poetic figures, your polysyndeton, your asyndeton, throw in some metonymy for something sweet, a transferred epithet for something spicy, and if you're really good, maybe there's some assonance or euphony for dessert, but you can only cram so much into one spoonful. So here, have one spoonful. How does it taste?